The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. Chapter 1. Our story takes place in the time of Queen Victoria. There lived in London two gentlemen who had been very close friends for many years. They were named Douglas and Griffin. One Christmas, they sat in front of the fireplace in Douglas's home telling stories. Griffin had just finished a ghost story involving a child. Douglas smiled sadly and looked thoughtful for a long moment.
Well, my friend, what do you say to this? I know a ghost story involving two children.
Well, I should say that is like another turn of a screw. Makes the excitement of it even stronger.
Finally, Douglas started narrating his story.
Griffin, my dear friend, I will tell you that story, as it was told to me by someone who experienced the whole thing directly. She has been dead for 20 years. She was a charming young woman called Elizabeth. She was the youngest of several daughters of a priest. At the age of 20, she came here to London to be interviewed for a teaching position. The gentleman who interviewed her was the uncle of two young children, whose parents had died in India. He wanted a governess to stay with them in the great country house named Bly. She was very impressed with his appearance and the way he talked. After a long conversation, he decided to hire her as a governess for his niece and nephew. However, he insisted she should deal with all matters involving the children, leaving him free to carry on with his own business. She happily agreed to this. When she traveled to Bly, it was a hot summer evening in June. Her mind kept swinging between joy and doubt. There was the obvious joy of success at having gained the teaching work. But then came the doubts. Would the children like her? Could she win the respect of the servants as the leader in the house? Elizabeth tried to put these thoughts aside and concentrate on the pleasant carriage ride and the sweet summer countryside. Then they passed through the wide iron gates, and she had her first view of Bly. She looked at the green lawns, the bright flowers, and ravens circling over treetops. The house had open windows and fresh-looking curtains. Waiting outside the main doors was a large, middle-aged woman and a young 8-year-old girl. The woman curtsied to her and introduced herself as Mrs. Gross, the housekeeper. The young girl was named Flora and was one of the children. She looked like an angel, beautiful and pretty, with lovely blonde hair in curls. That night, Elizabeth could not sleep. The day's events and the beautiful new room made her much too excited. The bed was large and soft. She had a mirror in which she could see herself fully for the first time in her life. Elizabeth had only one small worry. Mrs. Gross did not seem as pleased to see her as she had expected. But she soon forgot this, focusing on the thought of Flora. As dawn approached, she thought she heard the cry of a child far away, then the sound of someone walking softly past her room.
I must be imagining things,
she thought to herself. Later on, she wasn't so sure. The next day, Flora's small bed was carried over to her room. It had been agreed that from now on the girl would sleep in Elizabeth's room. That night, the three of them, Elizabeth, Mrs. Gross, and Flora, sat eating supper by candlelight. Elizabeth looked at Flora lovingly.
Is her brother as wonderful as her?
She asked.
Miss, you will see he is quite as marvellous as Flora,
replied Mrs. Gross. Elizabeth laughed.
It looks as if I'll be just as excited meeting the children as I was meeting the master. But now, tell me, when does Miles arrive?
She asked the woman.
Friday, miss, by the same carriage as you did,
Mrs. Gross replied. The following morning, Elizabeth asked Flora to take her on a tour of the house, as this would help her greatly to make friends with the little girl. Flora was very glad to do this, talking about every place they went to. Together they walked through all the corridors, empty rooms, and crooked staircases. They even climbed to the top of a square tower, and the height was dizzying. Soon the pair were good friends. That evening, a big envelope arrived for Elizabeth. Inside was a letter from the master, and also a smaller envelope. The master's letter said he was enclosing an envelope for Miles's school, and she was to deal with the matter without involving him. The school's letter gave her a sleepless night. Next morning, she discussed it with Mrs. Gross.
Miles has been expelled from school,
She said.
He'll come home for the school holidays, but they won't let him return.
The housekeeper's eyes filled with tears.
What do they say about him? What has he done?
She asked.
They are not specific about what he's done. They simply express regret they can't take him back. Mrs. Gross, I'm worried he's harmed others in some way.
Now the housekeeper's face turned red as flame with anger.
Miles would never injure others. He's only 10 years old. You might as well believe such things of little Flora as believe them of him.
The woman said nothing more. But in the evening, Elizabeth felt a desire to question Mrs. Gross more.
Has Miles ever been bad?
She asked. Mrs. Gross looked at the governess thoughtfully.
Well, miss, he has sometimes been a little naughty.
Now her face looked stronger.
But I like a young boy to be a little naughty.
So do I, as long as he does not harm others.
Mrs. Gross laughed.
Don't worry, miss. He won't harm you.
This comment made Elizabeth feel ridiculous, and she too laughed. But the following day she had new questions for Mrs. Gross.
Tell me about the previous governess.
Well, Miss Jessel was young and pretty.
Said the housekeeper, looking at the floor.
Just the way he liked them.
As soon as she said that, she looked at Elizabeth, startled.
I mean, the master, of course.
Elizabeth was certain that the housekeeper had been talking about someone else, but she did not insist.
What happened to Miss Jessel?
She asked.
Well, she left to go on holiday. Never returned.
Said Mrs. Gross, and fell silent. It was obvious that she did not want to speak any more. But Elizabeth persisted.
Why not?
She fell ill while away and died. The master never told me of what. That's all I know, miss.
Said the housekeeper, and left.
Chapter 2.
Elizabeth remembered very well the first time she saw Miles. He was waiting outside the hotel where they were to meet. He held a suitcase and was nervously looking for his new governess. Instantly, she felt he was as sweet as his sister. This feeling was made stronger as they talked on their way back to Bly, and the school's letter now seemed horrible to her.
He couldn't possibly be harming others. Obviously, there must have been some kind of misunderstanding,
she thought. She said that to Mrs. Gross, as soon as she could speak to her privately.
What will you do now, miss?
Mrs. Gross asked.
Why, nothing. I will not talk to Miles about it, nor the master, nor write back to the school,
exclaimed Elizabeth.
Well, miss, I'll support you, don't worry,
answered Mrs. Gross, and they hugged each other like sisters. They felt so united in their decision. The summer weeks passed joyfully for Elizabeth and the children. The governess didn't think much about what would happen with Miles's education. She was too happy to be bothered with dark thoughts. But slowly, this summer joy began to change. During those long days, after the children had gone to bed, she liked to walk around the big garden on her own, enjoying the twilight. She often walked and thought about the master, and she imagined how pleased he would be with her. She was taking care of things just as he wanted. She even imagined he would suddenly appear on the path before her, with an approving smile on his face. One evening, walking back towards the house, she felt for an instant her wish had come true. The tower came into view, and in it stood a man. He was looking intensely at her.
The master!
She thought. But it was not the master. A stranger stood there. She was so shocked that she felt she couldn't move. Everything suddenly seemed very still around her. Even the birds had become silent. Elizabeth and the man stared at each other for a long time. Then, slowly, he walked to the other side of the tower and disappeared from sight. Long minutes passed, and she did not move. Finally, seeing he did not return, she walked to the house. Mrs. Grose was anxious because she was late.
Where have you been, my dear?
She asked in a worrying voice. Elizabeth did not want to worry her.
It's such a beautiful evening,
She said.
I lost track of time.
Quickly, she said good night and went to her room. Later, she thought about the incident. She felt fear all over again, but forced herself to concentrate on finding a logical explanation. It was definitely a stranger. He wore no hat, and she had seen his face clearly. Only one explanation satisfied her. A stranger must have sneaked in, wanting to see the house more closely. Elizabeth decided to put the incident out of her mind, concentrating more on the children. She felt very happy with them. Every day she thought how lovely and innocent they seemed.
Surely then the school was mistaken about Miles.
She kept thinking, but she decided to say nothing to him, as this might upset him or Flora. One Sunday, the rain was so heavy that no one in the house could go to church. It faded away by the early evening, so Elizabeth decided to put the children to bed. Then she and Mrs. Grose attended church. They were just outside the gates when the governess realized something.
I left my gloves in the dining room, Mrs. Grose.
She said.
I must go back and get them. Will you wait for me here?
Sure, go ahead.
Answered the housekeeper, and Elizabeth hurried back. Elizabeth picked up the gloves, but suddenly she saw a man looking into the room. He was outside, with his face close to the window. Shocked, she recognized the stranger at the tower. He had the same intense stare, but now his eyes were searching around the room. She felt certain he was looking for someone other than her. Then he turned away, vanishing. She was more courageous this time, and ran outside to the place she had seen him. This time she would talk to him. But there was no sign of him, though she looked behind bushes and trees. Elizabeth was confused. Who was he? What did he want? Finally, she decided to stand where the stranger had stood, looking in as he had. Perhaps this would help her understand what he was looking for. She stood at the window, and then Mrs. Grose appeared in the room. She must have been wondering why Elizabeth took so long to return. But when she turned to look at the window, she turned white with shock and hurried out of the room. Elizabeth felt sure Mrs. Grose was running to her. One question was strong in Elizabeth's mind.
It was only me. Why does she look so scared? Did she see anything else?
Chapter 3.
Mrs. Grose appeared from around the corner of the house, flushed and out of breath. Elizabeth looked hard at her and said,
You look as white as a sheet.
I was worried when you didn't return, thinking something bad had happened.
Mumbled the housekeeper. Elizabeth felt that Mrs. Grose was hiding the real reason for her fear. Perhaps she too had seen the man at the window. Perhaps in the very same place. Now she no longer wanted to hide her experiences from the housekeeper. Elizabeth said,
Well, something very strange has happened. Just a few minutes ago, I stood in the room, and a strange man was looking through the window at me.
Where is he now?
asked Mrs. Gross.
I have no idea. He turned away and then vanished.
Elizabeth replied.
Have you ever seen him before?
The housekeeper asked.
Yes. One evening I was walking outside, and he was standing in the tower. He is a complete stranger to me, but somehow I feel I know him.
Elizabeth took a deep breath, desiring to speak plainly and openly.
Mrs. Gross, I'm sure he is no gentleman. The way he looked at me, it was horrible.
Mrs. Gross looked around worriedly. She tried to change the subject.
Come on, dear.
She said quietly.
We should go to church now.
That I won't do. I won't leave the children alone now. I'm afraid he might come back.
As she spoke, Elizabeth studied Mrs. Gross's face. Some instinct told her the other woman knew more than she was revealing.
Why did you never tell me you saw a stranger in the tower?
Mrs. Gross asked.
I had my reasons. One of them was that I didn't want to frighten you. He might, after all, have been just an innocent traveller. But twice now I have seen him, and he definitely seems to be searching for something. Or someone.
Mrs. Gross's face turned pale.
What does he look like?
She asked.
He has curly red hair and a red moustache. His face is long and pale. His eyes are sharp and, well, awfully strange. He didn't wear a hat. His clothes didn't seem to fit well, and they looked much too handsome for him.
Mrs. Gross sighed, shaking her head.
You do know him?
Elizabeth cried. Mrs. Gross nodded.
Quint. Peter Quint, the master's main servant. When the master left, Quint was in charge here. He would often put on the master's coats and waistcoats.
She said.
And where is he now?
Asked the governess.
He's dead, miss,
was the answer. Elizabeth shrieked at hearing this and almost fell over. Mrs. Gross caught her, trying to comfort her. She helped the governess walk back inside, and they sat in the dining room. Elizabeth felt very grateful the housekeeper believed her story, and they promised to support each other. When she was calm again, Elizabeth continued the conversation with Mrs. Gross.
I think I know who that man was looking for. Miles. Something tells me it was Miles.
There was silence. Elizabeth went on.
It is strange, Mrs. Gross, that the children have never said anything about him to me.
Well, Flora never had much to do with him, miss. Miles, though, well, they were friends. But it was more Quint coming to him, trying to make friends. He did that far too much with everyone here,
said the housekeeper.
Do you feel he was a bad influence?
Elizabeth asked curiously.
Yes, definitely,
Mrs. Gross replied.
Why didn't you tell the master then?
Continued the governess.
Well, the master doesn't like to be bothered with complaints. He hates them. And he had left Quint in charge here because he trusted him. But I admit I was afraid to say anything. Afraid of Quint, of how he might react. He was clever. I was worried for the children, but he was in charge of everyone.
Mrs. Gross began to shake and cry. Elizabeth kept questioning Mrs. Gross more about Quint's death.
It was strange and unexpected,
said the housekeeper.
One dark winter evening, walking on a public road, he slipped and fell down an icy slope. He hit his head on some rocks and he died.
All was clear for Elizabeth now. The man she saw was Quint's ghost, who had come back from the dead to haunt Miles and Flora. She was sure he had returned with some evil plan in mind, perhaps to steal away the children's souls. Suddenly, the governess was filled with determination.
I have to protect the children with all my strength.
She thought.
Only I can help them now.
Then another strange event happened a few weeks later. It was a hot, quiet afternoon. Everything was very still. Elizabeth sat on a stone bench by the lake sewing. Nearby, Flora sat by the water, playing with pieces of wood. Miles had stayed inside, reading near a window. Suddenly, Elizabeth felt a dark presence across the lake. Fear filled her, and though she had not looked up, she was absolutely certain it was a stranger. A stranger with dark intentions. Worried, she looked at Flora. The little girl was playing happily, trying to make a boat with her wood. A dreadful minute passed, and then Elizabeth managed to look across the lake to see who was there.
Chapter 4.
Several hours later, Elizabeth went to speak privately to Mrs. Gross. Filled with despair, she threw herself into the other woman's arms, crying,
They know! The children know! It's monstrous!
What do you mean, they know?
the housekeeper asked.
By the lake. There was someone on the other side. Flora saw. I know she did. She saw her. A horrible, evil woman.
Sobbed Elizabeth.
How can you be sure of that?
Mrs. Gross asked, her eyes wide with horror.
From the way she stared at Flora. She wore a shabby black dress and had a pale face.
A stranger?
Asked the housekeeper.
Yes.
Replied Elizabeth.
I've never seen her before. But I know who she was. Miss Jessel.
Mrs. Gross stared, speechless.
For heaven's sake,
Elizabeth continued.
don't say anything to Flora. I'm sure she'll deny it. She doesn't want me to know.
Perhaps she is trying to protect you by not talking about it,
Said the housekeeper. Elizabeth shook her head.
No, she's not trying to protect me. She has some plan in mind. Something dark. And now I'm afraid that Miss Jessel might appear only to Flora. And then Flora will listen to her, and I won't know,
She said in despair. Mrs. Gross, though looking terrified, spoke helpfully.
Dear, we mustn't lose our minds in all of this. Perhaps Flora likes her and it's all just a game to her. She's so innocent.
There was silence for a while. Then the housekeeper asked,
Could you tell what Miss Jessel wanted?
The way she stared. I felt her intention was to take Flora away. Somehow.
Answered the governess. Mrs. Gross stared out the window, shaking. Elizabeth spoke intensely.
You must tell me more about Miss Jessel. Were they close, her and Quint?
She asked the woman.
Yes, they were very close, even though she was a lady and he a servant. He had the power and the cleverness to get close to anyone, but she suffered for it finally.
Then do you know what she died of?
Elizabeth asked.
No, I was just glad that she was at peace, finally,
Said Mrs. Gross quietly. Some days passed, and Elizabeth tried to regain her calm. As she thought matters over, she felt she must not give up her efforts to save the children. She decided to accept this strange situation and do her best to protect the children. She continued teaching and playing with them, and it was very hard to believe they were capable of evil. They were so beautiful and happy in their play. However, she was determined to learn more about Miles. She tried to find out more from Mrs. Gross.
Once, you suggested that Miles hasn't always been a perfect little gentleman.
Said Elizabeth.
What made you think he could be bad? I myself have never seen him misbehave.
Well, for several months he and Quint were continually together.
Started Mrs. Gross.
I thought this was very wrong. Miles is on a social level far above Quint's. I was so concerned that I went to Miss Jessel about it, but she told me not to interfere in the business of others. But I was completely unsatisfied with this answer, so I went to Miles himself. I reminded him he was a little gentleman and should not lose this by associating with Quint.
What did he say?
asked Elizabeth.
He denied everything.
Said the woman.
He pretended they weren't together, but I knew they were. It was as if Quint was his tutor and Miss Jessel was tutor only to the little girl.
Mrs. Groce's voice saddened.
And there were other things, he said.
Elizabeth looked thoughtful.
So, did he lie to you?
She asked. The older woman lowered her head, not wanting to say this.
Miss Jessel didn't worry about them being together,
She said instead.
Do you think Miles knew about Quint and Miss Jessel's relationship?
Asked the governess. Mrs. Groce replied with her head still lowered.
Well, he didn't really talk about it openly, but I think he was trying to deny.
She could not speak. Elizabeth completed her sentence.
He tried to deny their relationship, but you were not fooled.
She paused, thinking of the past.
And of course there is the matter of the school's letter.
Now Mrs. Groce tried to defend Miles.
If he was so bad there, why is he such an angel now?
She wondered.
That is something I may be able to answer in the future. But now I want to go back to the time you approached Miles. There were other things, he said. Did he remind you maybe that you too were a servant, just as Quint was?
Asked Elizabeth. Mrs. Groce nodded.
Well, Mrs. Groce, these things you've told me mean I must be very watchful.
Said Elizabeth thoughtfully.
I don't know if the boy carries on a secret communication with Quint. I must just wait and see what happens next.
Chapter 5.
Days passed, and there were no new incidents and no appearances by the ghosts. Elizabeth continued teaching the children and playing with them, and the children's affection for her seemed to increase. They delighted her with their acting of drama plays. They would act as Romans or characters from the plays of William Shakespeare. But a doubt was constantly in her mind.
Is this affection a trick to hide their secret activities from me?
She kept thinking. She felt she herself had to hide her knowledge of the ghosts, for a while at least. Late one evening, she sat in her bed reading. Suddenly, she had a very strange feeling. Something, or someone, was quietly moving around the corridors. Elizabeth felt very afraid, but also had the strong desire to find out who was there. She took a candle, went into the dark corridor, then locked her bedroom door. Elizabeth walked to the top of the stairs. Suddenly, a soft wind blew out the candle. She looked down the stairs. A large window allowed early morning light in, so that she could see the staircase turning downwards. Right below the window, just by the turn, stood Quint. They faced each other, neither speaking. He seemed to recognize her. He was looking at her in the same hard, intense way he had looked from the tower and the garden. Elizabeth had never felt him to be as dangerous as at this moment. Though she was terrified, she forced herself to stare back at him, praying that this would somehow stop him from coming nearer. Long minutes passed, and the complete silence was becoming unbearable to her. When she thought she couldn't take it any longer and would scream, Quint slowly turned and vanished into the darkness. Elizabeth stood waiting for a while, but Quint did not return. She turned and walked back to her room. Closing the door behind her, she went to check on Flora. The bed was empty. Terrified, she pulled the bed covers back. There was no sign of Flora. Elizabeth looked around the room wildly and suddenly noticed a movement behind the curtain. Flora appeared, still in her nightgown, and smiled.
"Well, you have been naughty. Where have you been? I was looking for you,"
said the little girl. At seeing Flora unharmed, Elizabeth collapsed into a chair, shaking with relief. The girl hugged her, and they stayed like that for a long while. When she felt calmer, the governess asked,
You were looking out the window. Did you think I was walking in the garden?
"Well, I thought someone was."
answered the little girl.
Did you see anyone?
Elizabeth asked.
"No, no one at all."
Flora replied. Elizabeth believed Flora was lying, but she resisted a desire to say this plainly to the little girl.
Why did you make your bed look as if you were still in it?
She asked the child. Flora giggled.
"Well, I didn't want you to be frightened if you suddenly came back in."
Elizabeth was silent, afraid to question Flora any more. The following nights, the governess sat up until late. Checking first that Flora was in her bed, Elizabeth walked through the corridor, waiting to see if the ghosts would return. There was no further sign of Quint. But one night, she saw a woman sitting on a step of the staircase, exactly where Quint had been standing. The woman sat with her back to Elizabeth. Her head was in her hands, as if she was grieving about something. She was visible only for an instant. Then she vanished. The governess knew it was Miss Jessel. A few nights after this, Elizabeth suddenly woke up in the night. It was well past midnight when a bad feeling awakened her. She sat up in bed, looking across the room. In the moonlight, she saw Flora, behind the window's curtain, looking out into the night. Elizabeth felt a strong desire to see what Flora saw, but something made her keep silent. Quietly, she stepped into her slippers and put on her dressing gown. Her plan was to get to another room in the house with the same view as Flora had. She stepped out into the corridor and suddenly stopped. Miles's room was nearby.
Is he too looking out of his window, seeing what Flora sees? Should I go and catch him at this, and tell him that I know about their secret meetings with ghosts?
She thought, but she remembered how innocent and sweet the children were, and decided not to go into Miles's room or say anything. Quickly, Elizabeth walked downstairs and went in the room which was exactly under Flora's room. Swiftly, she went to the window and pressed her face to the glass. Moonlight was fully on the garden. She could see someone standing there. He was looking up at the tower as if he was looking for someone. Elizabeth was completely surprised and sickened to see that the person in the garden was Miles.
Chapter 6.
Elizabeth ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out to the garden. Miles came up to her, smiling, as soon as he saw her. Without a word, she took his hand, and they walked back to his room. They sat together on his bed for a while, both silent. Again, she didn't know how to talk to him about her deepest fears. At last, finding the strength to speak, Elizabeth said,
You must tell me now. Tell me the whole truth. What did you go out for? What were you doing there?
Miles smiled, then laughed softly.
"If I tell you why, will you try to understand?"
He asked. She nodded.
"Well, so that you would think of me just the way you're thinking of me now."
He said.
And what way is that?
Asked Elizabeth curiously.
"I wanted you to think that I'm bad for a change."
Miles replied. He bent forward and kissed her cheek. Elizabeth felt he was trying to comfort her, and she hugged him
So you didn't undress at all?
She asked him.
No, I sat up and read.
He said.
When did you go down?
She asked again.
At midnight. When I'm bad, I'm really bad.
Miles replied with a laugh. She bit her lip thoughtfully.
How did you make sure I would see you in the garden?
She asked.
I arranged the whole thing with Flora. She made you wake up, then you wanted to see what she was looking at.
Elizabeth now felt she had fallen into a trap set by the children.
You might have caught a chill, walking around down there.
She said. Again he smiled.
How else could I have done it and look bad enough?
They embraced again. Elizabeth was unable to say anything when she saw him looking so innocent and happy. The next day, Elizabeth asked Mrs. Grose to sit with her on the terrace and enjoy the afternoon sun. They watched the children walk through the garden. Miles held a book and read to his sister. Elizabeth glanced at Mrs. Grose. The older woman was lovingly watching the children, but Elizabeth could no longer see the children the way Mrs. Grose did. She felt the need to speak very openly now to the housekeeper.
They seem to be innocently reading a fairy tale, but secretly they are talking about them,
She said in a serious voice.
I'm sure of this now. They have never, even in the smallest way, mentioned Quint and Miss Jessel, and Miles has never mentioned school or why he was expelled. But all the time they talk to the dead. This is their great secret,
She said desperately. Mrs. Grose spoke with a trembling voice.
What other things have you found out?
She asked.
Their lives are almost completely separate from ours. The children do not belong to us. They belong to Quint and Miss Jessel. They want to take the children,
Cried the governess.
But why? They were bad when alive, it's true. But what can they do now?
The housekeeper asked.
They will try and take the children's souls. They were evil while alive, and carry that on now as demons. They are trying to make the children become evil like them,
Said Elizabeth in a trembling voice. Anxiety filled her face as she said,
I'm afraid of what they might be planning. I can't sleep at night because of the fear. Sometimes I even think I hear them whispering their terrible secrets to each other. I should confront the children about all this, but a greater fear holds me back. If I suddenly show them I know about them, what greater evil might they do?
There was silence, both women now looking terrified. Then Elizabeth spoke more strongly.
One thing I'm sure of, Mrs. Grose. The children will be destroyed unless we prevent it.
Mrs. Grose's face brightened as she suddenly had an idea.
Their uncle must prevent it. He must take them away from here. You must make him do this, miss,
She cried. Elizabeth's face showed dismay.
What? And write to him that his house is haunted and his niece and nephew mad? No! I promised not to worry him and to take care of everything in the house myself. I must keep my promise,
She exclaimed. The housekeeper grasped Elizabeth's arm, saying,
At least, miss, make him come to you somehow.
The governess stared at the other woman angrily.
Make him come. Him? Listen to me carefully.
She said.
I will not do it. Furthermore, if you try to contact him yourself and ask him to come,
Yes, miss.
Mrs. Grose stuttered.
I will immediately leave. Him, you, and the children.
Threatened Elizabeth.
Chapter 7.
A month went by, and Elizabeth had not seen the ghosts. She was still unable to speak openly to the children, as she was afraid of what they would do if they knew their secret was exposed. She carefully avoided discussing death with them or the return of the dead. Also not welcome was the discussion about people who had once lived at Bly. The children, however, endlessly questioned Elizabeth about her own life and history. They wanted to know about her brothers and sisters, her father, and the house she had lived in. She didn't mind speaking about these things, yet always had the suspicion that Miles and Flora were really trying to take her mind away from their secrets. One day, in the middle of her lesson, Flora put her pen down.
Miss, when is our uncle coming to see us?
She asked unexpectedly. Elizabeth felt surprise at such a question and wondered if this was part of some new secret plan.
Well, Flora, I expect him sometime, but I'm not sure when,
answered the governess. Miles smiled at her and said,
Flora and I have talked about this. What we want to do is to write to him. We want to tell him about our everyday life here, and of course, ask him to visit us.
Elizabeth smiled back at him.
That's a splendid idea, Miles. You should both write then, and I'll make sure the letters reach him,
she said. Elizabeth, of course, had already decided she would not post them. She had promised not to disturb the master, and she intended to do so. Moreover, she still hoped to solve all problems herself. So, when the children gave her their letters, she locked them in a cabinet in her room and never posted them. Summer turned into autumn. The leaves on the trees browned, withered, and fell. One clear autumn morning, they were all walking to church. Miles and Elizabeth were walking together, while the others were some distance ahead. For a while they all walked in silence. Suddenly, Miles asked in a most charming voice,
Look, miss, when, for the love of heaven, am I going back to school?
Elizabeth was completely surprised and almost shocked. How to answer him? She had to choose her words very carefully. She was slow to respond, and he carried on.
Well,
he winked at her and smiled.
I can't always be around ladies and girls, even if they're as nice as you. After all, I'm getting older. I need the company of other boys.
In a confused voice, she replied,
Why, yes, you're right. You are getting older.
They stopped walking. Miles asked,
I have been a good boy, miss, haven't I? Except for that one night.
Then he looked at her, slyly.
You know, I could do that again.
At this, Elizabeth replied more firmly.
Certainly. But you won't.
No, I won't. But when am I going back?
He insisted. She took his arm, and they started walking again.
Were you happy at school?
She asked.
I can be happy anywhere,
was the boy's answer.
Well then, if you're happy here,
started Elizabeth.
But here isn't everything. I want to see more of the world.
Miles interrupted.
I see,
she said quietly. The church came into view. Flora, Mrs. Gross, and some other servants were on the steps waiting for them. Elizabeth felt some relief. In the church, they would have to stop talking, and this tense conversation would end. But then Miles repeated more strongly,
I do want my own type of people.
Elizabeth laughed, nervously.
Well, there aren't many of your type, you know. Unless perhaps dear little Flora.
Now Miles spoke angrily.
Are you really comparing me to a baby girl?
Elizabeth felt helpless to answer. They stopped again. They were now standing among the gravestones in front of the church. Miles continued pressing her.
What does my uncle think? About my behavior, I mean.
He asked.
I don't think he cares,
she said.
No, but he can be made to.
Miles replied.
How?
Asked Elizabeth.
If he's made to come here,
he said.
But who'll get him here?
Elizabeth asked.
I will,
shouted the boy. Elizabeth felt afraid he would contact the master without her permission, even without her knowing. Giving her a hard look, he turned and marched off alone into the church. The governess sat down on a nearby slab, feeling completely helpless.
Chapter 8.
Elizabeth sat on the slab trying to think about what to do. It wasn't only her fears about the ghosts. There was also the matter of the boy's dismissal from school. He knew she had great trouble dealing with it. She was sure that Miles was aware of her secret fears and was trying to use this knowledge to gain more freedom. Perhaps she should have written to Miles's uncle much sooner. But it would have been a painful thing to do, a complete loss of the trust the master had shown her.
But Miles is right, that the matter of his return to school must be attended to,
she thought.
Oh, it's so confusing, trying to decide what to do.
Panic gripped her. Elizabeth felt a strong need to get away, even if only for a few hours, away from the children, the house, away from everything. It was the perfect time for that. Most of the servants were at church, so no one would stop her. She stood up and walked quickly back to the house. She saw no one. She ran up the stairs, then suddenly stopped. How could she arrange for a carriage so quickly? She collapsed on the stairs, feeling helpless. There was no way to escape. Suddenly, a new horror overwhelmed her. It was exactly at this point on the stairs that she had seen Miss Jessel with her head down in her hands. This made her stand up, and she continued up the stairs. She headed for the schoolroom, where there were things belonging to her. Opening the door, she stopped in her tracks. Someone was sitting at her table in the clear noonday light. The figure had her back to Elizabeth, head in hands, as if very tired. Long minutes passed. Then the figure slowly pushed the chair back, stood up, and turned to face Elizabeth. Miss Jessel stood there silently, in her dress as black as midnight. Her face looked very sad, but at the same time her look was strict and challenging. Elizabeth was stunned. She felt the look meant, "Since you sit at my table, I can sit at yours. You are the intruder, not me."
You terrible, miserable woman!
Elizabeth cried out. The sound rang through the long passageway and the empty house. Miss Jessel looked at her, as if she had heard and understood, and then she vanished. There was an awful silence.
I must stay,
thought Elizabeth.
I must stay and face whatever happens.
Time passed and the others returned from church. Elizabeth was very surprised that no one questioned her about her absence. However, Mrs. Gross did look at her in a strange way. Elizabeth looked for the older woman later in the kitchen. There was a smell of freshly baked bread. Mrs. Gross sat in front of the fireplace with an anxious expression on her face.
What did the children say about my absence from church?
Elizabeth asked.
Well, miss, they asked me not to question you about it. They said you'd like that better. Master Miles told me we must do nothing but what she likes. Sweet Miss Flora said, of course,
reported the housekeeper. Elizabeth looked thoughtful.
Well, it seems I came back for a meeting with Miss Jessel,
she said. Mrs. Gross sounded horrified.
You saw her again? Did she speak? What did she say?
Nothing,
said the governess.
but I could see it in her face. She suffers the torments of the damned. She wants Flora to
Elizabeth's calm voice turned to distress.
share those torments with her. But that will not happen. I have made up my mind now. I must definitely send for their uncle.
Miss, for pity's sake, do!
exclaimed the woman.
Miles thinks I'm afraid of him now.
Elizabeth continued.
He told you all that to please me, but that's just a trick. I'm sure he has a plan to deceive me. But his uncle shall hear everything from me, including the letter from the boys' old school.
You'll show it to the master?
Asked the housekeeper.
I should have done so as soon as I received it.
Answered the governess.
Oh, no!
Tears ran down Mrs. Gross's eyes.
And we don't even know what he was expelled for!
She said.
What else could it be but some evil thing or something really bad? After everything that's happened here, you should understand that. I see now their uncle is to blame. The people he left in charge.
She cried.
He didn't really know them,
said Mrs. Gross, looking boldly at Elizabeth.
I don't want the children to suffer.
Elizabeth returned her hard stare.
Then what am I supposed to tell him?
She asked.
Nothing. I'll tell him,
said the housekeeper.
How? You can't write.
Elizabeth exclaimed.
I'll get someone from the village to write down my words,
exclaimed the woman. Elizabeth was very annoyed.
And will you let a stranger know all about our private business?
She asked, strictly. Now Mrs. Gross looked helpless, and fresh tears began.
Oh, miss, you right.
I'll do so tonight,
said Elizabeth, and then left.
Chapter 9.
Late in the evening, Elizabeth sat in her room, trying to write to the master. Rain drummed on the windows, and the wind moaned around the house. She stared at the paper in front of her. It was still blank. Writing was much more difficult than she had imagined. Suddenly, losing patience, she got up and went out to the passageway. With her candle lighting the way, she walked to Miles's door quietly. She stood there for a while, listening for any sound. Suddenly, she heard him call.
Come in.
She entered, saying,
How did you know I was there?
Why, I heard you, of course. You are as quiet as a herd of horses.
Why aren't you asleep, Miles?
she said and laughed.
Well, I'm busy thinking.
He hesitated.
Thinking of you, I must say, and this strange business of ours.
Elizabeth was tense as she asked,
What business?
You know, the way you bring me up, and this school business.
He continued. She took a deep breath.
Certainly you'll go back to school, but not to the same one. We'll find a better one. How could I know it was troubling you when you have never spoken of it, never said a word about it to me?
She said. With his eyes wide open, he smiled at her.
Haven't I?
Elizabeth wondered about his innocent look.
Never, little Miles. You've never talked about your teachers, friends, or anything that happened at school. So you can see how much in the dark I was about your life there. Until this morning, when you asked me, I thought you were only interested in your life in Bly.
She said to him.
No, I want to get away. I like Bly, but, well, you know what a boy wants.
He exclaimed.
To go to your uncle?
She asked. He looked at her and said firmly.
I say again, you must get him here. You must settle things with him.
But he'll take you away,
cried Elizabeth.
Don't you understand? That's exactly what I want.
Said the boy.
You'll have to tell him. You'll have to tell him a lot of things.
He spoke very strongly, and Elizabeth felt she had to do the same.
How much will you tell him, Miles? There are things he'll ask you.
Very likely.
He said.
But what things?
She came close to tell him about the ghosts.
Things you've never told me.
She said instead.
Then he'll know what to do with you.
There was silence for a while. Then Miles spoke more quietly.
I just want something new.
Elizabeth wanted to make him speak openly to her, but did not want to lose his friendship.
Well, Miles, I've just begun a letter to your uncle.
She started.
Well then, finish it.
He said impatiently. There was silence again.
Miles, what happened?
Asked the governess.
Before you came back from school, and before you went away.
What happened?
He sounded puzzled, yet trying to tell her something.
My dear little Miles, I just want you to help me save you.
She cried. Then there came a gust of ice-cold wind, and there was sudden darkness. Miles shrieked, and Elizabeth could not tell if it was with joy or terror. She immediately jumped to her feet. In the moonlight, she saw that the curtains were in place, and the windows still closed.
The candle's out!
She cried.
I blew it out, miss.
Shouted Miles. Elizabeth stared at him. Had he, or had the ghosts blown the candle out? And was Miles trying to hide this? The next day, Elizabeth gave the children their lessons as usual. That day they seemed more brilliant pupils than ever before, solving arithmetic problems even faster than her. After dinner, Miles came to her, saying he would like very much to play the piano for her. He was so charming, she was convinced he wanted to renew their friendship.
Perhaps this is the way I can help him,
she thought. She agreed, and hand in hand they went to the schoolroom. His playing seemed sweeter, more marvelous than ever before. She forgot time and listened as if under a spell. Then, suddenly, a question came to mind, and she put it to Miles.
Where is Flora?
Miss, how should I know?
He answered and laughed happily, then continued playing. Quickly, Elizabeth went out, searching the nearby rooms. No sign of Flora. She hurried downstairs to Mrs. Gross.
She must be upstairs, miss. You must have missed her in one of the rooms,
said the woman reassuringly.
No. Now I feel sure she's outside somewhere,
shouted the governess, worried. Mrs. Gross stared at her.
Without a hat?
She asked. Elizabeth looked hard at the older woman.
Miss Jessel was always without a hat,
she replied.
They must be together right now. Now I understand Miles's plan. He kept me here with him while she went to find that horrible woman. And Miles must be with Quint right now. Oh, what a devilishly clever plan.
She stopped to think a moment.
We must look immediately for Flora. I'll deal with Miles later.
She pulled a letter out of her pocket.
The servant Luke must take this to the master. Mrs. Gross, will you help me look for Flora or stay with Miles?
She asked the housekeeper. The woman's eyes whitened in terror.
No, don't leave me alone with them,
she cried, and they both hurried outside.
Chapter 10.
Elizabeth knew where Flora was.
The lake!
She cried out.
That's where I last saw them together.
The two women quickly walked towards the lake, which came into view after some minutes. There was no sign of Flora. Nor was there any sign of the small rowing boat normally tied nearby.
She must have used the boat to get to the far side,
Elizabeth said.
But, miss, that little child, all alone?
Mrs. Gross asked.
And where is the boat? I can't see it anywhere.
Elizabeth looked at her sternly.
She is not alone, and she is not a child. She is really an old, cunning witch.
She pointed to some trees on the farther shore which grew very close to the water.
That is probably where the boat is. Come on, it will take us a good 10 minutes to walk around,
Elizabeth exclaimed. At last they reached the place behind the trees. There was the boat, pulled partly up the shore. The oars had been placed neatly in the boat, but Flora was not there. The two women searched for the little girl, looking about wildly. Beyond the trees there was a clear space of grass, and there sat Flora. She smiled when she saw them, Then she bent forward and plucked a bunch of withered fern from the ground, which she held up to them. Mrs. Gross ran to her, quickly embracing the child tightly. Elizabeth stood still, watching all this intently. Over Mrs. Gross's shoulder, she saw Flora's eyes, watching her as closely as she watched the little girl. They looked at each other for a long time. Suddenly, Elizabeth had the strong feeling that there could be no more secrets between her and the children. They should now speak about everything openly. Mrs. Gross stood up, and the fern dropped from Flora's hand. There were some moments of unbearable silence. It was Flora who first spoke.
Miss, where's your hat?
Where's yours, my dear?
The governess asked her back.
And where's Miles?
Flora asked. At last, Elizabeth asked what she had stopped herself from asking for so long.
I'll tell you if you tell me.
Her voice quivered.
If you tell me, where's Miss Jessel?
The name had never before been spoken between them. Their relationship had now changed forever. Flora looked as if she had been struck, and Mrs. Gross gave a gasp of horror. Then Elizabeth grasped the housekeeper's arm.
She's there! She's there!
She shouted, pointing across the lake. Elizabeth could see Miss Jessel on the opposite shore. She was dressed exactly as other times, staring at them evilly, as terrifying as ever.
Look! Look! It proves I'm not mad!
She cried again. Shaking, Mrs. Gross looked along the length of Elizabeth's pointing arm. Flora, however, did not turn her head. She continued staring at the governess, a hard and angry look.
This is completely unnatural,
Elizabeth thought.
Not a child, but an old woman. She's there! You unhappy little thing! And you know it as well as I do.
She shouted at Flora. Mrs. Gross groaned.
Miss, where do you see her?
She's over there,
Repeated the governess.
You don't see her? Look! Look! She's as big as a blazing fire!
Again the older woman groaned, shaking her head. A feeling of helpless horror filled Elizabeth. Only she could see the ghosts, and no one would believe her. Miss Jessel and Flora, Peter Quint and Miles, in their clever, devilish way, they had all defeated her. Mrs. Gross turned to Flora comfortingly.
No, nobody's there. Poor Miss Jessel's dead and buried. We know that, my sweet. It's all a mistake or a joke. We'll go home as fast as we can.
Flora now spoke to Elizabeth.
I see nothing. Nobody. I never have. I think you're cruel and I hate you now.
She said and put her face in Mrs. Gross's skirts.
Take me away. Take me away from her.
She cried. Elizabeth looked across the lake again. Still, Miss Jessel stood there, looking hard as stone. The governess spoke in a sad voice.
Yes. Take her and go. The truth has come out, but it has trapped me, and I'm all alone. I tried to help you, but she was too powerful. I've lost you. Take her and go, I said.
Clutching Flora to her, Mrs. Gross hurried away. Elizabeth awoke and saw she was lying on the grass. She realized she must have collapsed and had been weeping. Some time had passed since Mrs. Gross and Flora had left. The governess walked slowly back to the house. A heavy silence seemed everywhere, and there was no sign of either Mrs. Gross or Miss Jessel. She went to her room to change clothes. All of Flora's things had been removed. Elizabeth ate her supper alone in the schoolroom, then sat by the fire. She felt terribly cold. At some point, Elizabeth looked up and saw Miles at the door. They looked at each other for a long moment, and then he entered the room and sat down heavily in a nearby chair. There was absolute stillness and silence.
Chapter 11.
Early in the morning, Mrs. Gross appeared at Elizabeth's bedside.
Miss, Flora's ill. She has had no rest all night. She has a fever and keeps denying she saw anything at the lake or has ever seen anything. She seems so much older now,
She said in a sad voice.
I'm sure now Flora will never speak to me again.
The governess told her. Mrs. Gross lowered her head in sadness.
I'm sorry to say you're right, miss. She never will again. She keeps asking if you're coming in, and she's very afraid of that,
She said.
I see. Has she said anything at all about Miss Jessel?
Asked the governess.
Not a word.
The housekeeper replied. Elizabeth thought about this. Then she said,
Flora is controlling everything now, in line with her plan. She wants to get rid of me, and she'll try somehow to make her uncle think I'm the cruelest creature in the world. But I've been thinking. For a while, I was very near to just packing and leaving. But now I have a better plan. It's you who must leave, with Flora. Then she'll be away from those demons, and away from me. Go straight to her uncle and tell him everything.
But what will you do, miss?
wondered the woman.
I will try to win back Miles' loyalty. If he and his sister are separated, and he and I are alone, there is hope. Has he seen her since the trouble at the lake?
Elizabeth asked.
No.
Mrs. Gross replied.
I've hardly ever left her bedside, and those few times I did, I was careful to lock the door behind me.
Elizabeth nodded.
Good. They must stay separated, or else my small hope will be destroyed. That hope, Mrs. Gross, comes from this. Last evening, Miles sat by me for 2 hours near the fire. I knew he wanted very much to speak to me, but he couldn't find the words. We kissed goodnight in the end. I'm sure that in a day or two I can get him to talk,
She said. Mrs. Gross lowered her head.
Well, I do believe your plan is the right one, miss. Last night, as Flora turned restlessly in her bed, I heard her say things, such horrible things.
She said thoughtfully.
About me?
Asked the governess. The housekeeper nodded, then sat down heavily on the bed, head in hand. Mrs. Gross's voice quivered sadly.
Such terrible things for a young lady to say. It isn't natural. Where could she have learned?
From them, Mrs. Gross.
Interrupted Elizabeth.
That's why I must take her away.
The older woman responded.
Far from them, and then she may be free.
There was silence for a while.
Another thing I've just remembered, miss.
Mrs. Gross continued.
Your letter was never sent. I asked Luke about it, and he says he never saw it. I know what's happened to it. Miles took it.
Elizabeth nodded.
That doesn't surprise me.
She said.
By now he'll have read and destroyed it. Perhaps that was one of the things he tried but failed to say to me last night. There wasn't much information in the letter anyway. Mostly it was a demand for an immediate meeting with the master.
Now Elizabeth spoke more strongly.
But I'll get a confession out of that boy. He'll have to tell me everything. Now take Flora and go.
A little later, from a window, Elizabeth watched the carriage drive away. A frightening thought came to her. She was alone. She had no one now to whom she could speak about her troubles. She also noticed the way the servants looked at her. The sudden departure of Flora and Mrs. Gross had made everyone feel something was wrong at Bly. But no one asked her anything, though she was sure they very much wanted to. She tried hard to make herself seem calm and in control of things.
I must not lose their respect and obedience,
she thought. However, it was Miles who seemed to be challenging her position as leader. She was told by maids that he had taken breakfast with Mrs. Gross and Flora before they had left, and then gone out for a walk on his own. Elizabeth realized now that he would no longer ask permission from her to do anything. He felt he had complete freedom now. Their relationship was completely changed.
I can be his teacher no more,
She thought.
but I might be the one who saves him.
On their last night together, she asked that supper be served to them together. It was in the room where she had first seen Quint through the window. They ate in silence for a while. Then Miles suddenly asked,
Is Flora very ill, miss?
It's just that she doesn't feel comfortable at Bly anymore.
answered the governess.
Very sudden, wasn't it, miss?
Continued the boy.
Not really. Day by day she looked more and more unwell.
Elizabeth replied.
I see.
He said to that and stopped. Elizabeth felt more and more tense as she waited for the right moment to speak openly. The servants came and cleared away the plates. Miles stood looking through the window where Quint had appeared. Then he turned around.
Well, miss, now we're alone,
He said with a strange smile.
Chapter 12.
Elizabeth smiled back at him.
Well, not absolutely. I mean, the others aren't too far away, are they?
She asked.
No, I suppose they aren't too far.
He said, and walked hesitantly to the window, looking out at the garden. Elizabeth watched him closely. The boy looked uncertain. She felt excited, realizing the moment she was waiting for was getting closer and closer. He wanted to talk to her about things hidden and things they had been too afraid to discuss till now. He was finding it very hard to be completely open with her. Miles turned around, smiling.
Well, I think I like Bly very much now,
He said.
You've certainly seen a lot of it these past 24 hours. I hope you've been enjoying yourself.
Elizabeth asked.
Certainly. I've seen so much of it. But I'm wondering, with all that's been happening lately, if you're happy to be with me now, alone.
He said to her.
I stay here as your friend, Miles. I have a huge interest in you while we still live together in the same house.
She answered. Miles laughed.
Well, you know, I thought you were so interested in me because you wanted to get something from me,
He said.
Well, yes, I do. But I still haven't got it.
Elizabeth replied.
Miss, you want me to tell you something.
The boy said in a serious voice.
Yes, Miles, I do. Right now. Tell me what's in your mind.
She said impatiently. He picked up his hat, saying,
So that's why you've stayed here, even after everything that's happened, especially to Flora.
Her heart thumping hard. Elizabeth nodded, but her voice was weak as she watched him playing with his hat.
Are you leaving now?
She asked. He was silent for a while, then replied,
I'll tell you everything. Anything you like, but not now.
Why not now?
She insisted. He stopped looking at his hat and stared hard at her.
I have to see Luke.
He said.
Well then, go to Luke. But before you do, tell me something. Yesterday afternoon, did you take my letter from the table in the hall?
She asked finally. Suddenly, Elizabeth saw Peter Quint at the window. His face was sickly white as he glared in at them. She moved forward, clutching Miles's arm. She felt she should keep him facing her and away from the window. She was now fighting a demon for the soul of the small boy she held. Closer to him now, she saw Miles's face was as white as the face in the glass. Sweat was appearing on the boy's forehead. His voice was faint.
Yes, I took the letter,
Was Miles's answer. A sense of victory filled Elizabeth. She hugged Miles, but kept her eyes on Quint. He was walking restlessly along the wall, from one side to another. Every so often he would stand still and glare in at them again.
Why did you take it?
She asked again.
To see what you said about me.
The boy said.
And did you read it?
She asked.
Yes, I read it.
His voice was getting weaker.
But you found nothing in it.
She shouted joyfully, as if she had beaten Miles in some kind of game. His head lowered. Miles nodded in agreement. Elizabeth suddenly realized she had been looking closely at Miles, away from the window. Looking there, she saw Quint had vanished.
I'm winning,
she thought.
So what did you do with it?
She asked.
I've burnt it,
he whispered.
Is that what you did at school? Take things? Did you steal, Miles? I know you've been expelled.
She exclaimed. He gave her the strangest look she had ever seen from him.
No, I didn't steal. So you know I can't go back.
I know everything. But tell me, what did you do?
She asked for a second time. He looked around the room. He took in several deep breaths and spoke with difficulty.
Well, I said things. I suppose things some people would call a bit naughty.
He smiled in a tired way. Elizabeth was completely surprised.
Said things?
She asked, then paused for a long time.
Who did you say those things to?
I don't remember their names. Just a few of the other students I liked,
he told her. Elizabeth still held him tightly. This was not at all what she had expected. She was sure that his ghost companions would have made him act far, far worse. She believed that theft or maybe violence would have been the reasons why he was expelled. But now he sounded so innocent. She felt confused, and she suddenly let him go. Sighing, he turned to face the window again.
Did they repeat what you told them?
She asked him.
Yes, they did. To others they liked. And I suppose teachers must have heard them,
he said.
Miles, the teachers haven't told me what you said.
She told him. He turned to look at her with a sickly smile.
Well, I suppose they didn't like to write it down,
he said. Then Quint reappeared at the window. He too was smiling, as if it was really he who was winning this time.
No more! No more!
She screamed at the glass.
Is she here, Miss Jessel?
Asked the boy.
No, but the horror's at the window,
Elizabeth exclaimed.
It's he?
Miles said.
Who do you mean?
She shouted. Miles shouted too.
Peter, Quint, you devil, where?
He won't take you, Miles. I have you. Miles!
Cried the governess. Miles's breathing had become harder and harder. He stumbled forward, falling into Elizabeth's arms. She could feel he was soaked in sweat. Quint had again vanished from the window. She looked at Miles, and he smiled at her. In a weakening voice, he said,
Now, maybe we've got rid of him.
Those were his last words. His eyes closed, as if he had fallen into sleep, and he laid lifeless in her arms.